In a small, forgotten town, shadows of betrayal lingered in the heart of an old man who carried secrets darker than his wrinkled skin. His family thought he was weak, powerless, and at the edge of death. But beneath his fragile frame burned a fire of vengeance that refused to die. This is the tale of a grandfather who waited too long, watching silently as his own bloodline tore him apart. But when patience finally reached its end, the old man decided it was time for his final revenge, one that no one in his family would ever forget. Eldric had always been the quiet pillar of his family, the kind of man who worked with rough, calloused hands and a steady heart, never demanding anything in return for the sacrifices he made. His children grew up under the shelter of his discipline and hard work, but with each passing year, they seemed to forget the weight of what he had carried for them. Once his home had been filled with the echoes of laughter, the clatter of plates at dinner time, and the small voices of his grandchildren asking him for stories. Now that same house stood hollow and cold, its walls heavy with silence. The children he had raised with devotion were nowhere to be found. They had left him, not just in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered, emotionally, spiritually, and morally. They had abandoned him when he was too old to keep fighting, too frail to carry his burdens alone, as if his years of love had been nothing but an obligation they were eager to escape. It wasn't as though Eldric hadn't seen the change coming. He had noticed it in the way his sons no longer looked him in the eyes, their words growing shorter with each visit, their presence always rushed, as though they had better places to be. He had felt it in his daughters too, who once clung to him for protection but now spoke to him with impatience, as if his slowness, his forgetfulness, was an inconvenience. The grandchildren who once adored his stories now scrolled through glowing screens, barely acknowledging his presence. Eldric was a relic to them, a burden they had no use for, and their neglect carved deep scars into him that no one seemed to notice. The final blow came the day he fell sick and lay in bed, expecting one of them to arrive at his side. None came. Days passed, and the only companion he had was the echo of the clock ticking in the hallway, a cruel reminder of how quickly life slipped away when no one cared to notice. The neighbors helped when they could, leaving food at his doorstep, but his children, the very blood he had given life to, were absent. That was when Eldric began to understand the cruel truth. They had not just abandoned him by chance. They had chosen to leave him behind because in their eyes, he no longer served a purpose. He had given everything, but in their hearts he had already died long before his body would. The old man replayed his sacrifices in his mind like a broken record. He remembered the nights he stayed awake working extra hours so his children could have better schooling, the winters where he went hungry so they could eat, the years of enduring hardship with a quiet determination so they would never feel the weight of his struggles. And yet when the time came for them to return even a fraction of that care, they walked away. Every memory of his sacrifice became poisoned, twisted into something bitter, and each passing day in that empty house fed the growing anger inside him. He told himself at first that perhaps they were just busy, that life had simply pulled them away, but even when he tried to reach out, their voices over the phone were cold and distant, filled with excuses. It wasn't that they couldn't come, it was that they didn't want to. He began to recognize the truth hidden beneath their shallow words. They were ashamed of him, of his frailty, of the way age had stolen his strength. They wanted to forget him because he no longer fit into their world of ambition and pride. And as that truth settled into his chest, Eldric felt something darker awaken within him, something that had been buried beneath years of patience and silence. The nights grew longer, and in that solitude, his mind wandered. He thought of the blood that tied them together, blood that had once been sacred but now felt like a chain choking him. He thought of the looks of disappointment he had endured, the harsh words, the careless disregard for the man who had given them everything. Eldric sat alone in the dim light of his old lamp, the shadows stretching across the walls like ghosts of the past, and he felt his heart harden. For so long, he had believed that family was a bond unbreakable, something sacred, but abandonment had shattered that illusion, leaving only bitterness and betrayal in its place. His children had left him to rot in silence, and the weight of that realization grew heavier every day until it no longer felt like sadness. It felt like fuel, burning hot inside him. Eldric's mind became haunted by the idea that all his sacrifices had been wasted. That thought tormented him in the quiet hours of the night, as he lay awake listening to the creaks of the old house. The pain of being forgotten dug into him, twisting his once gentle soul into something unrecognizable even to himself. He began to wonder if the love he had poured into his family had been nothing more than a lie, a story he had told himself to make the years of struggle bearable. The truth was harsher, more unforgiving. They never truly valued him. They took what they needed and discarded him like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. That was when the seed of revenge first rooted itself in his thoughts. He did not think of it in grand terms, not at first. It was simply a whisper, an idea that crept into his mind as he sat in the darkness. If they could abandon him so easily, then perhaps they did not deserve the peace of forgetting him. Perhaps they needed to be reminded of the weight of his presence, of the blood that bound them, not through love but through fear. The pain they had given him could be returned, not in angered outbursts or pleading words but in something colder, something final. And with that realization, Eldric's heart beat with a grim clarity he had not felt in years. The hidden cracks in Eldric's family began to show long before anyone admitted they existed. But it wasn't until he was left alone that the shadows of those secrets finally came to light. At first it was subtle, a whisper carried by the neighbor who spoke too freely, a strange look exchanged between his sons when they thought the old man wasn't watching, a folded piece of paper tucked carelessly into the pocket of a jacket left behind. Eldric had lived long enough to understand that silence was often louder than words, and soon he realized the distance between him and his children wasn't born out of neglect alone. Something darker had been festering beneath the surface, hidden truths that explained their cruelty, their lack of care, their eagerness to abandon the very man who had raised them. One evening, as Eldric rummaged through a pile of old documents, he stumbled upon a letter that wasn't meant for him. The handwriting was rushed, almost angry, and the words cut into him like a blade. It spoke of money that had gone missing years ago, land titles that had been manipulated, and a betrayal that went deeper than simple abandonment. His own blood had profited from his sacrifices, not by working hard or honoring his name, but by deceiving him. They had built their lives, their wealth, their reputations on lies that used him as the foundation, and once they no longer needed him, they cast him aside. The letter confirmed what his instincts had already been whispering. His family hadn't just forgotten him, they had stolen from him, betrayed him, and then buried the truth beneath years of false smiles. The betrayal did not stop at stolen wealth. There were secrets of infidelity, whispered scandals that Eldric had been shielded from, a granddaughter whose paternity was questioned, a son who had turned his back on the family business to serve his own selfish interests, and another who had forged documents to seize what was never rightfully his. Eldric pieced it together slowly, each revelation slicing deeper into him until his chest ached with more than age. It was not only the neglect that burned him, it was the realization that the very family he had devoted his life to had been using him as a stepping stone while mocking him behind closed doors. He began recalling moments that once seemed harmless but now revealed their true colors. The way his eldest son avoided discussing the family's old farmland, brushing off Eldric's questions with false cheer. The way his daughters whispered in corners, exchanging looks when finances were mentioned. The moments when laughter died the instant Eldric walked into the room, replaced by forced politeness. All of it was evidence that he had been the blind old man in a house full of actors, each of them playing their roles while their hearts held nothing but greed and resentment for him. The weight of those revelations pressed hard on Eldric's weary shoulders. He had thought abandonment was the greatest cruelty they could offer, but betrayal made abandonment feel like mercy. They hadn't just left him behind. They had betrayed his legacy, his name, and everything he had worked for. They had conspired against him while sitting at his table, smiling with mouths full of food bought from his labor. And the worst of it all was that they felt no shame, no guilt. In their eyes, he was already too weak to matter, too old to fight back. They believed his silence would last until his final breath, that he would go to his grave never knowing the truth. But Eldric knew now. He knew the lies, the theft, the cold-blooded betrayal that ran in the veins of his children, and the knowledge hardened his soul like stone. It was no longer about being abandoned by ungrateful blood. It was about justice for a lifetime of deception. As he sat in the dim light of his failing home, clutching the letter that confirmed it all, Eldric felt the weight of his years melt away. His heart was old, yes, but the fire that burned in his chest was not the flame of a man near death. It was the fire of someone who had been wronged beyond forgiveness, a man who had nothing left to lose. And it was in that fire that the shape of his revenge began to take form, sharper and colder with each secret he uncovered, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eldric sat alone in his crumbling house, the clock on the wall ticking with a rhythm that seemed to mock his wasted years. Each tick echoed in his hollow chest, a reminder that time was slipping away, that his life had been reduced to waiting. waiting for care that never came, for love that was never returned, for family that would never again walk through his door. But as the hours bled into days, and the silence of the house grew heavier, Eldric realized he was done waiting. The betrayal that had once broken him now fueled him, and where weakness once resided, a new resolve began to take shape. The old man was not as powerless as his family believed. If time was all he had left, then he would use it carefully, methodically, to ensure that when his end came, his revenge would strike with precision, leaving scars that could never be erased. The planning began subtly, almost invisibly, like the turning gears of an unseen machine. Eldric studied the very people who had wronged him, piecing together their patterns the way one might study prey before the hunt. He listened closely when they bothered to call, not for their words but for the slips between them, their greed, their worries, their vulnerabilities. Each detail became a note in his mind, a thread to weave into the trap he was quietly preparing. He remembered where the bodies of old family secrets were buried, the weaknesses they hoped would stay hidden, and with every recollection, he felt the outline of his plan grow sharper. Eldric began keeping a notebook, a weathered leather-bound journal that he filled with careful handwriting late into the night. On the surface, it looked like the ramblings of an old man clinging to memories. But each page was a blueprint of destruction. Names, dates, accounts of betrayals, connections between debts and stolen wealth, all of it laid out with the cold precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. He knew the inheritance they coveted, the lies they feared being exposed, and the rifts already beginning to crack between siblings. His role was not to create new fractures, but to widen the ones already there, to let suspicion and greed turn them against one another until they destroyed themselves. The more he wrote, the more the ticking of the clock became his ally. Time, once his enemy, was now his weapon. His family thought he would fade away quietly, but Eldric understood that patience was his strength. A lifetime of sacrifice had taught him how to endure, and now he would use that endurance not for love but for vengeance. Every step of his plan was bound to the passage of time, like a clock winding down to its final strike. He would not rush because haste left room for mistakes. Instead, he would move slowly, letting his family grow comfortable in their lies, never suspecting that the man they abandoned was watching, calculating, preparing the very noose they would one day hang themselves with. At night, Eldric practiced the art of silence. He rehearsed conversations in his head, imagining how he would drop fragments of information into the ears of one child to sow distrust in another. He thought about letters he could send anonymously, words crafted to ignite paranoia and fear. He remembered places in the town where secrets could be whispered and spread like wildfire until they grew too large to contain. And he envisioned the day when his children, who had once mocked his frailty, would look over their shoulders in dread, realizing too late that their father's silence had not been weakness, it had been the sharpening of a blade. Though age had bent his back and slowed his steps, Eldric carried within him a patience that no youth could match. He moved through his days deliberately, every small action feeding into the larger design. What his family saw as the helpless drifting of an old man was, in truth, the careful winding of a clock that was counting down to their reckoning. Each tick was a promise. Each hour that passed brought him closer to the moment when his revenge would no longer be a thought scribbled in a notebook, but a reality none of them could escape. The day the letter arrived, it was wrapped in nothing remarkable, just a plain envelope, the kind anyone might overlook. But the weight of its words would strike like a hammer. Eldric had chosen his moment with care, waiting until the unease in his children's lives was already simmering, waiting until the guilt of neglecting him had become something they pushed deeper and deeper into silence. That silence was what he would shatter. His trembling hands, though frail with age, were steady enough to write the words that would set everything in motion. He wrote not as a father, not as a victim, but as a phantom, a whisper from the shadows, one that knew their secrets too well. The letter was unsigned, its tone detached yet sharp, filled with fragments of truth buried inside carefully chosen lines. There were no direct accusations, only hints, questions, and reminders of things they had all hoped to forget. The first went to his eldest son, slipped into the post with nothing to identify the sender. You know the land you claimed was never yours. Do you think the others have forgotten? That single sentence was enough to ignite suspicion. Eldric knew greed had already driven a wedge between his children. All he needed to do was widen it. To his daughter, he sent another, one that spoke of the rumors she had worked so hard to bury. Does he know the child is not his? To another son whose hands were not clean in business, he wrote. "The debt you buried will not stay silent forever." The brilliance of the letters lay not in what they revealed, but in what they suggested. Eldric didn't need to expose every secret all at once. He only needed to plant seeds of doubt, seeds that would grow into vines strong enough to strangle the fragile threads that held his family together. Within days, whispers began to circulate. His children, who had once ignored him so easily, now turned suspicious eyes toward one another. They grew restless, searching for answers they could not find, asking questions no one dared to answer directly. Each believed the others might know something they didn't, and in their paranoia, cracks began to show in their carefully constructed facades. Eldric watched from afar, silent and unseen, the corners of his lips curling faintly when he overheard the neighbor mention how his son had stormed out of a family gathering, face red with anger, muttering about lies and betrayals. The letters had begun their work. For the first time in years, Eldric felt a rush of power, a surge that coursed through his frail body like fire. He was no longer the forgotten old man rotting in solitude. He had become something more, a ghost that haunted their every step, an invisible hand pulling at the strings of their lives. The brilliance of it was that none of them suspected him. To them, he was still the withering patriarch, too weak and pitiful to orchestrate anything so cunning, and that blindness was his greatest weapon. The beauty of the letter was not only in its message but in its timing. They arrived when each child was already facing their own silent battles, financial strain, troubled marriages, fading reputations. Eldric knew these weaknesses intimately, for they had once been confided to him in trust, back when his children believed him to be their foundation. Now he used that knowledge with ruthless precision, pressing just enough to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. One letter alone might not have broken them, but combined, they were like drops of poison in a well, subtle, unseen but devastating as they spread. At night, Eldric sat back in his creaking chair, the lamp casting a dim glow over his journal, where he recorded each reaction, each shift in their behavior. He wrote as though documenting a story already told, because in his mind their downfall was inevitable. The letters were only the beginning, the first strike of the clock as it inched closer to midnight. The fear he had planted would not fade. It would grow, gnawing at them, making them question not only one another but also themselves. Eldric's silence had once made him invisible, but now his silence made him omnipresent, an unseen force wrapped around every thought they had. The paranoia began as a whisper, soft and almost unnoticeable, but soon it grew into a storm that rattled the walls of Eldric's fractured bloodline. His children, who once walked with the arrogance of entitlement, now moved with eyes that darted, voices that trembled, and hearts that beat too quickly under the weight of suspicion. It was the letters that had planted the seed, but it was their own guilt and greed that allowed the seed to grow. Eldric didn't need to lift another finger. They were destroying themselves in front of him, and the old man sat back, silent and watchful, as though he were listening to the ticking of a clock only he could hear. Conversations that had once been casual and hollow now carried sharp edges. His eldest son no longer trusted his siblings and began to keep documents locked away, carrying keys on a chain that clinked nervously at his side. The daughter, who had once hosted gatherings with a smile, now refused to look her brother in the eyes, her laughter forced and brittle, her hand clutching her glass of wine too tightly. The youngest, who had always been careless in his dealings, grew erratic, his nights restless, his temper short. Each believed the other was hiding something. Each believed the other might have written the letters. And in that suspicion, the fragile unity they pretended to share began to collapse. Eldric heard of their arguments through the small-town whispers, for secrets never stayed secret for long in a place where eyes were always watching. A neighbor mentioned a shouting match that had spilled out onto the driveway of his eldest son's house. Another recalled seeing his daughter leave a family dinner early, her face pale, her hands shaking. The town didn't know the truth, but Eldric did. He knew that the cracks were widening, that the words he had so carefully chosen in his anonymous notes were now twisting themselves into the very heart of his children's minds. And yet the beauty of it all was that none of them dared to confront him. To them he was still the withered old man sitting in a sagging chair, too weak to plot, too broken to care. Their arrogance blinded them, even as their fear consumed them. They searched for the source of their torment in one another, accusing, doubting, tearing apart bonds that had already been frail. They spoke in hushed tones, checked over their shoulders, and trusted no one, not even the ones who shared their blood. Every interaction became a battlefield. A simple dinner turned into veiled accusations. A question as small as, "Where were you last night?" carried venom behind it. Their eyes flickered with distrust, and every word spoken was weighed and measured as though it might contain a hidden threat. The paranoia was no longer a seed. It was a wildfire, and Eldric had lit the match without ever stepping into the flames. At night, Eldric imagined them tossing and turning in their beds, wondering who might betray them next, who might already be plotting their downfall. He smiled at the thought that his silence had become a haunting presence in their lives. He didn't need to confront them, didn't need to raise his voice or demand justice. The clock was ticking, and each second it struck pulled them deeper into chaos. They were unraveling themselves, and all Eldric had to do was watch, patient as ever, knowing the moment for his final strike had not yet come. Eldric had waited long enough to know the exact weight of the moment when a life's work was finally done. The notebooks, the letters, the whispered insinuations. All of it had been carefully placed like instruments on a table whose final note he intended to strike. He did not crave spectacle. He wanted certainty. He wanted his family to experience the slow, serrated unmaking of everything they'd built on his labor and their lies. So he arranged the pieces to fall in a way that would ensure maximum ruin without ever revealing the trembling hand that set the dominoes in motion. He began with what he knew would hurt them where pride lived strongest, the public face they had polished for years. Eldric enlisted an old friend from the market, a man with a memory like a ledger who owed him more than a favor. Together they curated evidence, photographs tucked away, accounts traced back to names the family thought long buried. A ledger, with entries that matched the forged signatures Eldric had discovered. Not everything that destroyed them would be direct. Reputation, once tainted, corrodes quietly until even the most solid structures buckle. He sent copies to people of influence, the town clerk who still remembered every oath, the former bank teller who had once doubted the eldest son's explanations, a local journalist with a taste for the scandalous. Each envelope carried documents and questions arranged to look like an outsider's investigation, a righteous uproar seated in civic curiosity rather than familial vengeance. He watched as the first public ripples became a wave. Accusations that had lived in the dark now had the light of corroboration. Contracts were re-examined, the town began to mutter in the market, and invitations to galas and gatherings that had once been taken for granted quietly stopped arriving. The eldest son found himself summoned to meetings where men in suits questioned land deeds he had claimed, and his voice, used to barking orders, cracked when it mattered most. The daughter's social circle, quick to separate from scandal, slid away with a silence louder than any accusation. The youngest son, whose loose tongue had always been his danger, was caught in a financial audit that bared his misdeeds like an exposed wound. Yet it was not only the public unraveling Eldric orchestrated. He had learned that vengeance tasted most bitter when it came from within, so he set traps that would turn their own hands against them. He forged a small, carefully crafted note, which he never signed but let a mutual acquaintance discover, hinting that one sibling had been plotting to sell the farm to an outside developer and pocket the proceeds. He left a whispered rumor, engineered through a barroom conversation he pretended not to overhear, that a certain deed had been altered late at night. Arbitration was called, tempers flared, and private meetings dissolved into shouting matches. The family, once able to convene with stiff smiles and deflections, now met with the rawness of people who suspected each other of theft. Trust, he realized, was not a thing you could recover once torn. It curled like paper left in the rain. There were moments he savored like a man tasting a long-anticipated meal. He stole into the crowd at a charity auction where his daughter sat proudly on a panel. She excused herself mid-speech, pale and trembling, because someone in the audience asked a question she could not answer. He read the headlines about the eldest son's land dispute and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with closure and everything to do with the justice he had imagined for decades. Yet even as the ruin took shape, Eldric maintained his outside persona, frail, confused, the grandfather who shuffled to the window and watched the world pass by. That mask was as important as any letter or ledger. If they suspected him, any vindication he sought would be softened, diminished by the knowledge that the man they'd scorned had done this deliberately. He wanted their downfall to be raw, unadorned by pity. There was one final instrument he kept hidden until the hour was right: his will. Eldric had been meticulous in drafting it over months, inserting clauses that would expose their greed in the most personal, humiliating way. He left small, symbolic, bequests to servants and neighbors who had treated him with kindness. People's names he knew would hurt the children's pride if mentioned in the reading. He bequeathed the old farmhouse not to the eldest son, but to the village, a trust stipulating the land become a memorial and community garden, depriving them of the tangible legacy they had thought was their inheritance. More devastating than money, he left a confession taped under a false bottom in his writing desk, a recording in which he recounted in calm and steady tones the betrayals he'd witnessed, the thefts, the lies, and the friends who had helped him document them. The recording named names, dates, and deeds, and it was set to be published to a local paper the moment of his choosing. When the day of the reading came, Eldric surprised everyone by being lucid. He sat with an unassuming dignity as lawyers and relatives gathered, their faces a collage of exhaustion and feigned composure. He listened as they anticipated an easy settlement, a final chapter where they could salvage dignity with smiles and speeches. Instead, his voice, brittle but clear, called the lawyer's attention to a clause that required a public reading, and the release of the enclosed recording should certain disputes remain unresolved. The lawyer, stunned, fumbled, and the room went still. As the first pages were turned and the recording played out in her gravelly voice, gasps and curses fell like stones. Faces drained of color, alliances cracked audibly, and the oldest, most guarded secrets unspooled under the steady narration of the man they had thought powerless. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. One son left the house in a fury that convinced neighbors he might come back with violence. The daughter, whose social life had been her refuge, was called into meetings where acquaintances avoided her like a contagious thing. The youngest, who had blamed his misfortunes on the world, saw his bank accounts locked and his business dealings unravel as partners distanced themselves. They could not blame each other without exposing further scraps of their own corruption. And yet, with each passing hour they tried, and their attempts dissolved into accusations that made the public scandal worse. Eldric, seated in his armchair, felt a dark satisfaction as he watched their world collapse into the same ruin they had once paved for him. He did not celebrate in grand gestures. His revenge was not about gloating, but about balance. He had given them back the currency they understood: fear, shame, and loss. He had made sure their legacy would no longer stand untouched, that their names would be tied to the truth of what they had done. And still, as the hours wound down and the house grew quiet once more, he felt a complicated peace, not the giddy triumph he had imagined, but something more akin to a tired exhale. He had waited, planned, and finally struck, ensuring that the memory of his life would not be one of silence and neglect, but of a reckoning they would carry like a mark upon them.